Afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Balance, Getting to Carbon Neutrality Through Carbon Sequestration and Offsets. This is the third session of a 5-part webinar series running through May 18th. I am Melissa Hetrick, Acting Energy and Climate Manager at the City of Santa Barbara, and I will be your host today. So just a few housekeeping reminders. We are recording this webinar. We will take questions at the end of the presentations, and you can type questions as they come in mind and chat, or use the raise hand feature when we get to the question and answer session. The webinar team will work on an accompanying Q&A document for posting to the website. Today's session is carbon markets, demand side considerations. Before we get to our speakers, I did just want to quickly review the purpose of these webinars. The 2022 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report urges the time for action is now and identifies rapid pathways to cut global emissions by 50% within this decade. In California, the Air Resources Board is working on the 2023 scoping plan update with strategies to balance emissions and carbon sinks by 2045. One thing is clear, achieving carbon neutrality will ultimately require offsetting emissions that we cannot mitigate or reduce otherwise. Whether this is at the scale of an individual project, an entire organization, or a whole community, carbon offsets will increasingly become a part of everyone's climate action toolkit. But what are offsets and how do they work? Who creates them? Do they actually reduce emissions? How much do they cost to create or purchase? How can we support local sequestration projects and offsets? We have these questions too, and we are local governments, air pollution control districts, and nonprofits seeking ways to initiate and expand local sequestration projects so we can meet local, regional, and global carbon goals. We are not experts, but over the past 2 years, we researched and built our knowledge. With this webinar series, we seek to inform our larger community. We hope this series will increase your awareness and interest in the possibilities of facilitating local carbon sequestration and offset projects as ways to improve land management and stimulate economic development. We want to thank our 2 event hosts, the Central Coast Climate Collaborative and the Santa Barbara County Regional Climate Collaborative. Both collaboratives are growing networks for public agencies, nonprofits, businesses, and community-based organizations seeking to collaborate in addressing our region's climate challenges. We invite you to visit their websites and learn more about each collaborative to find ways to engage. So these are the 5 sessions contained in the overall webinar series. The first 4 sessions are educational. So session 1 covered the basics and advanced inner workings of carbon offset markets. We learned that carbon offsets represent reductions that have already taken place and need to be real, additional, verifiable, enforceable, and permanent. We learned about the process for generating offsets and about the voluntary offset market. We also heard about California's short voluntary offset supply, yet high demand. Session 2 covered the protocols, market actors, and considerations of the supply side of carbon markets. We heard from Climate Action Reserve about their compliance and voluntary offsets and their Climate Forward program. We heard from the Climate Trust, which focuses on nature-based solutions. They described developing reforestation projects with landowners and tribes under Climate Forward. Nori rounded out the session by describing their carbon marketplace and methodologies for regenerative agriculture practices. They also brought one of their project developers to give a firsthand account of the process. Session 3 today will explore the demand side considerations of the market through the perspectives of local government, a university, and a project developer consultant. Session 4 will go beyond carbon markets to explore ways in which land stewards are already caring for the land through regenerative practices. and how non-market programs can support them. Our final session is designed as an interactive discussion featuring an opportunity for series participants to engage in an open discussion, debrief their key takeaways, and consider existing and future needs and resources to facilitate local carbon sequestration projects and offsets. This interactive last session requires separate registration. So all of our videos are being recorded, and we're putting those as well as other content coming out of these programs on our website, which is www.centralcoastclimate.org/sequestration. While this series focuses on carbon offsets and carbon sequestration projects, we recognize that they are not the only solutions to meeting carbon neutrality or supporting land stewardship, nor should they be. This series is not an endorsement of any particular solution, approach, or company. It's meant to be a compilation of practitioners who will share their experience and perspectives on this complex topic. And now on to our session for today, focused on the demand side of the offset equation. First, we'll hear from Jennifer Reed, Air Quality Services Manager at Dudek, about utilizing offsets for projects and best practices for incorporating offsets into a CEQA evaluation. Then we'll hear from Karla, Dailey, Acting Assistant Director of Utilities with the City of Palo Alto Resource Management Utilities, about their carbon neutral program and their current use of offsets to achieve that program's goals. We'll then hear from Persad, Campus Sustainability Manager at UCSB, who will discuss the development of UC-specific standards for offsets and how those may be used to meet the UC's climate goals. And finally, we'll hear from Chris Reed, Sustainability Manager at the City of San Luis Obispo, about the city's ambitious greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer Reed.
All right, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Reed. I lead Dudek's air quality and greenhouse gas team, and I'm here to discuss the use of carbon offsets in the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. So on our agenda for today, I will go over some key background for conversational context, make sure we're all on the same page. Then we'll discuss the CEQA process and CEQA mitigation considerations, and I'll add in some personal thoughts to close. So a few slides on background just to set the stage. Okay, let's start with why we're even talking about greenhouse gas offsets in CEQA. Well, first, increasingly stringent statewide greenhouse gas reduction targets result in associated stringent numeric thresholds at the project level. On the flip side, the combination of how challenging the courts have made developing a numeric threshold and the subsequent general lack of greenhouse gas guidance has made a zero threshold inviting, and while defensible, it does require offsets for the vast majority of projects. So ambition is a good thing, but problem is in 2022, regulations and technology are not reflective of 2030 goals or beyond, certainly not carbon neutrality, as CARB's in progress scoping plan update for 2045 carbon neutrality does show that going into the negative with carbon sequestration and capture is needed to offset the greenhouse gas emissions we just can't reduce to zero at that time. So likewise, most projects in CEQA may not be able to be below stringent numeric greenhouse gas thresholds. And this is really where offsets can play a role in mitigating greenhouse gas emission impacts under CEQA. So offsets are a useful tool in the CEQA practitioner's toolbox. For one, you may be able to avoid an unnecessary EIR if that was the only impact, because then you can mitigate it. But if it's already an EIR, instead of having a significant and unavoidable impact where you implement all feasible mitigation, call it a day, you get more out of the project with the purchase of offsets. Not only do you get the offset, but it comes with an incentive to put money into bettering the project. And you also avoid overriding considerations that are necessary with significant impacts. So offsets are not perfect, but CEQA isn't a perfection statute, and like CEQA, offsets can do a whole lot of good. But not everyone agrees on the use of offsets. It's actually an extremely controversial issue within the CEQA realm. And it's not just the standard opposition groups. There is a difference in opinions amongst most experts in the CEQA field. So we talk a lot about offsets. At first it was just like demystifying offsets. What are they? But lately it's been this uphill battle against misinformation and the level of critique really unseen in other CEQA issues. So when you use offsets in CEQA, there are specific considerations to account for, and my goal today is to shed some light on those. So John, Brian, and Rich did a wonderful job in session 1, providing the foundational basics and a lot of important CEQA considerations. So if you haven't watched it, I encourage you to go back and view it, as I'm going to try to focus on additional meaningful info today and not be super redundant, but to highlight some of the key relevant points for today. One carbon offset is 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent that is destructed, avoided, or sequestered. And this is convenient, right? Because that's how we report greenhouse gas emissions under CEQA. Offsets must meet specific criteria. Additional is an important one. Offsets go through a robust process.
Jennifer?
Yeah.
I think something's going on with your mic. It
Is
sounds
it?
really like underwater, and is there another mic you could change to?
I can try. Is it still bad? Okay, here, let me stop sharing for a moment. So sorry, everyone.
It's okay. If it's going to take a lot, then just go ahead. You can hear you. It's just kind of.
Oh, okay. Okay. Some other people said it sounded fine. So
okay.
Let me go back. Okay. Let me try this again. Sorry. Let me just start sharing the screen. Thanks everyone for hanging in there. Okay, can you see my screen again?
Yes.
Okay, all right, awesome. Okay, I think I was saying that offsets must meet specific criteria. Additional is an important one. Offsets, they go through a robust process that takes time, and this process supports why offsets are legitimate. There's a low supply in California. Here's the big one. Offsets are allowed in CEQA. I cannot emphasize this enough. Offsets are also allowed in AB 900 leadership projects, which CARB approves. There has been some unfortunate case rulings. The arguments against offsets have shaped this general degree of mistrust of carbon registries, along with a degree of misinformation. There are very good arguments for and worthy arguments against using offsets as mitigation in CEQA. Session 1 did a great job highlighting those. For my presentation, I'm going to assume that we're all on the side of arguments for. The location of offsets does not matter scientifically, but it can be considered as policy. Offsets generate co-benefits, but not the local co-benefits that are maybe desired. Nonetheless, CEQA still represents a growing demand for voluntary offsets. So again, session 1 discussed the case law regarding offsets, but I'm going to bring it up again here because we use this case law to help revise and refine our offset mitigation measures so they do not meet the same fate. Now, regarding the Golden Door Properties LLC versus County of San Diego case in 2020, the court determined that the supplemental EIR mitigation measure MGHG1 contained unenforceable performance standards, meaning that lacking sufficient safeguards to ensure offsets were real, permanent, verifiable, enforceable, and they failed to require offsets to be additional, and then it also improperly deferred and delegated mitigation. Little less known, but following Golden Door, there was 3 EIR cases within San Diego County. None of these cases are citable legal precedent. That's great, but there is still lots to learn from them. Importantly, all 3 project EIRs were certified before issuance of the 2020 Golden Door decision. Nonetheless, all those EIRs are subject to application of the case all the same. Totally not fair. I've also been told that CEQA is not fair sometimes, but as such, and despite strong efforts to develop a more defensible mitigation, the courts determined that all of these EIRs had the same general issues. So lack of performance standards, no mention of protocols, and international offset concerns. So same flavor, but still they give us some food for thought. So these 4 cases shape how we write offset mitigation in CEQA, and I have used them as my checklist of do's and don'ts. I will note, though, that greenhouse gas emission analyses, like many CEQA issue areas, do incorporate a level of risk tolerance. There's not one single recipe. How extensive the mitigation is depends on the project, lead agency, and unfortunately, the level of opposition. But assuming that no one is scared away by those cases and still wants to make this work, I am with you. So let's see how greenhouse gas emissions analysis under CEQA would look like. But before using offsets, you want to start with a very solid greenhouse gas emissions analysis. So first you identify the threshold. Is it 0? Is it a non-zero value? Then you quantify the project generated greenhouse gas emissions inventory, which at a minimum should include construction operation, but sometimes consider a loss or gain of carbon too, which I'm going to take a little detour into next. So assuming the project is over thresholds, because why else would we even be talking about it in this scenario, then you mitigate those greenhouse gas emissions to the extent feasible with on-site project strategies. And I'm not talking about like a light list of mitigation. This should be like an extensive deep dive into what is possible. And then lastly, you offset the remaining greenhouse gas emissions. So I developed a little mock CEQA analysis so we can all play along. Just threw some numbers out there. Includes 100 single-family residential units, 25,000 square feet of retail, a 30-acre site, which conversion of 15 acres of that land, and then planting of 125 trees. So actually, first, let's go ahead and do that little tangent on carbon storage and sequestration per the flavor of this webinar series. So we have a group of people at Dudek who are really dedicated to advancing the estimation of carbon storage and sequestration potential in natural and working lands. And why I've found that super interesting and really useful. Many of those approaches and tools they're time intensive and they require a level of detail not always known at the CEQA stage. However, it is possible to include carbon stock changes in a CEQA analysis, and two great tools for that are CaliMod and iTree. When do you choose to calculate carbon loss and gain in a CEQA analysis? Generally, I think specific guidance is not available, but lead agencies may be an exception, so always good to check. In my career so far, I typically apply my own professional judgment. For most projects, it's been very obvious, like when a project cuts down a grove of trees, or it's a large plan and the bio report shows that acres upon acres of vegetation loss. In other projects, it's a little harder to decide. I generally try to make my decision based on if the substantial loss of carbon that may occur and then the actions that make up for that, like restoration or tree planting, just doesn't seem to be enough. And then you may have a net negative and you don't want to exclude accounting for that. When you do decide to include this analysis, my recommendation is to include the entire inventory. So when you estimate gain, estimate loss, and estimate loss, estimate gain. I've mostly included carbon storage and sequestration in the project's greenhouse gas inventory, but you can also include the gain as a mitigation measure, just not something I've done as regular. But overall, this is really not common in CEQA greenhouse gas inventories, or maybe I say that yet. Even with my team's vast experience on this subject, I think it only happens in like 1 or 2% of our projects, but again, that may change. So yeah, I've included it here today in the spirit of the webinar, but also because I think it's really fun. So here is one example vegetation tool, CaliMod. The greenhouse gas analysts out there are going to be very familiar with this, but as a disclaimer, this is how it's currently developed. It does calculate greenhouse gas emissions associated with vegetation activities of land use change, and planting of new trees. So again, this presentation may be outdated in a few weeks when CaliMod, the new one, comes out. This still presents a calculation methodology which can be easily applied in the spreadsheet and represents a simplistic approach using data available at the CEQA stage. So CaliMod calculates carbon loss when changing land use. For example, you go from scrub to developed land, and it assumes that all of that carbon is released in the atmosphere. It also calculates carbon gain when planting trees and presents these as a one-time carbon stock exchange. Okay, so now back to the CEQA process. Thanks for letting me go on that detour. So table 1 here presents construction greenhouse gas emissions. In this mock scenario, over 3 years of project construction resulted in around 980 metric tons of CO2e. Table 2 here, this is the loss of sequestered carbon from that land use change, and it was around 170 metric tons. Next in the CEQA process, we're on the operational side. Table 3 shows operational greenhouse gas emissions. This was totaling around 450 metric tons of CO2e per year. And then table 4 is the gain of sequestered carbon. That's the tree planting, which was around 89 metric tons. All right, now table 5 shows us coming all together in this complete greenhouse gas emissions inventory and a CEQA analysis. So while this table shows how to amortize emissions to get to this annual operational emissions estimate for comparison to a threshold and then determining significance, for offset mitigation, you want totals. And in this scenario, I chose a threshold of 0. So I want all project generated greenhouse gas emissions to be mitigated. My personal preference is for construction operational offset mitigation to be separate. So either as separate mitigation measures or separately discussed within a measure. And that's because construction is typically retired up front before the grading permit is issued. And operation could be retired differently, such as annually or maybe even reevaluated under a true-up process. So under this scenario, the construction mitigation totals 1,150 metric tons and operation totals 13,410. So that is that 447 operational number times the project lifetime, which I assume to be 30 years in this case. Now we're on to the CEQA mitigation considerations, which is quite likely one of the most extensive CEQA mitigation you have ever encountered. So hang in there with me. So obviously, per the previous example, we need an offset mitigation. So let's talk about how to craft a better one. But here's some fine print. There's no one right way to do this. However, in an effort to provide some real practical advice today, I'm going to throw out some ideas based on my experience. Some of these are like check the box items I truly do feel are necessary, but the level of details for others depends on your risk tolerance, like I mentioned earlier. And again, warning, the level of detail required to have a legally defensible offset mitigation is sometimes mind-blowing. I really haven't seen this standard of detail held to other mitigation in CEQA. So here's my list for offset mitigation. I'm going to go over a few more in detail, but not all of them in essence of time. If you're curious about all of them, just send me a question. We can circle back. So step 1, start with identifying the amount of greenhouse gas offsets needed. That's an easy one. Step 2, specify when the greenhouse gas offsets need to be retired. So retiring an offset means it is claimed against the project carbon footprint, and it has been taken out of circulation to ensure that it only can be claimed once. Step 3, spell out the objective criteria, and I say also define it. The 5 criteria you need to include, I'm sure this is just burned into your memory now: real, additional, permanent, verifiable, and enforceable. Step 4, identify geographic priorities and how to advance through them. Step 5, identify the registries that offsets can be purchased from. Step 6, mention protocols in some form. Step 7, ensure decision-making by individuals who are educated in assessing credit validity. Step 8, permanent safeguards of ongoing verification concerns. These have really come down to what happens when an offset is reversed. So discuss the process of how registries deal with this, with buffer pools and everything. And step 9, this is on the forecasted mitigation units or FMUs. So first you decide if you just want to use them or not. So if yes, then you have to be very clear in the mitigation on the difference. You have to explain the FMUs. This is a future offset. These were explained wonderfully in session 2. And to echo that presentation, CEQA projects are a great source for funding for these great projects, but it does add another layer to the mitigation language. So I wanted to highlight step 1, which is identifying the amount of greenhouse gas offsets needed. So obviously we need to specify how much in the mitigation, but I wanted to note 2 things here: project lifetime and true ups. So first, the life of a project is commonly cited to be 30 years, but there are cases where you may have a project specific lifetime to use instead. So regarding the 30 years, it's not like a residence is going to be demolished in 30 years and replaced with a different land use, but that's a minimum of being like 2052 from today. And by then, the greenhouse gas inventory for projects will look much different. After all, the state wants to be carbon neutral by 2045. Nonetheless, I have seen comments on project lifetimes, so just be prepared for that. So second, this is the bigger one: decide if this number can or cannot be modified. Is the applicant stuck with the EIR estimated emissions, or do they have an opportunity to revise it? If it can be revised, include a true-up provision. but it needs to be a full accounting. So no picking and choosing, and I'd say make it a public process. You don't want anything behind the curtain. So a true provision that can be initiated by the applicant. I feel like this is reasonable because there are advancements in technology. Maybe something feasible at the time of analysis is now feasible, or maybe it's more cost effective or generates greater reductions, or maybe there's just a more accurate way to estimate emissions. So while a true up is a practical strategy in ensuring more accurate accounting, some people just do not like it. So I have to say also prepare for that. The next one I wanted to highlight was step 4. This is the geographic priorities and how to advance through them. So this is a policy best practice. This is not a science-based recommendation, but it is a widely applied best practice because people really want the offset to occur as close to the project emissions as possible for those co-benefits. So here's an example, of course, after you exhaust all those on-site measures. So first layer is within the county, second one is within the state, third is within the United States, and fourth is internationally. But you do need to decide if you're going to allow for offsets originating internationally or not. There's nothing innately wrong with them, but it got a bad rap in Golden Door. So some do choose to eliminate them as just a risk aversion decision. However, given the state of demand outweighing supply, dipping into international supply may be necessary. So just something to keep in mind when making that decision. Generally, this mitigation measure does not need caps on how much in each of these geography layers, if it's implemented correctly, because you have to exhaust availability in each level before moving to the next. However, placing a limit on international was encouraged in Golden Door. Also, it's great to define the metrics of what makes an offset available and if price is a consideration. So this identifies the means of which an applicant can advance through those geographic priorities. Another key step worth highlighting in step 6, this is defining the standards that the offsets meet, which effectively means to mention protocols in some form. The recent court cases did spend some time on protocols in the mitigation lack thereof. So it's something to consider again at a minimum, explain them, but even better, I think, attaching the protocols. The protocols provide a lot of evidence to defend the technical adequacy of the offset. It addresses a lot of issues the case has brought up, and it sets forth quantification. So does it make for a mitigation that is long and has lengthy attachments? Yes. Does it increase the defensibility? Also yes. The last step I wanted to highlight is step 7. This is the performance standards enforcement. So we all know what not to do with this one, which is deferring to a decision maker. But what is the best to do is something I think the industry is still working through. The goal is to make sure the decision-making individual can make an educated decision. But the fact of the matter is that most lead agency planners are not experts on offsets. So there's been 2 general options I've seen floating out there. So one is this development of a guide to assist the lead agency in making decision. If your mitigation has enough of that objective criteria, it can guide the decision maker. So an implementation flow chart for a staff person without expertise, that can help them make the decision, like a check the box exercise. Or lead agency can get a third-party verifier to review to meet the mitigation requirements. This has been done on a few very big project EIRs. So yes, the registries, they also have third-party verification. This is likely unnecessary, but it does answer the court's opposition critiques. So what's next in the CEQA process after you have the mitigation measure and the CEQA document is approved and the applicant wants to get going? So my personal recommendation is to hire a broker. They're so helpful and they're so knowledgeable. They help you get through the process. I did a little example on cost just for fun. Please do not quote. But remember in our mock scenario, we had around 15,000 metric tons. So at $5 an offset, that's around $73,000. At $15 an offset, you're looking at around $218,000. And at $25 an offset, you're in the higher end of like $364,000. But the reality is it's likely a mix of cost for that geographic priorities, and it's going to land somewhere in between those values or maybe even higher. So for example, your first 1,000 offsets, they could be forestry within California, maybe those are $25, and then the next 1,000 are in the US for $10. Talk to John McDougall more about that. This again was just a little fun exercise. So note that in my example, this was a smaller project. Most real life examples, and certainly the projects I've worked on, result in a lot greater greenhouse gas emissions and associated offset costs. So lastly, on the CEQA process, you follow your mitigation framework closely and retire offsets as it specifies. All right, wrapping up. So for my closing thoughts, I've said this for years, and this is my little soapbox moment, but I've been on the successful and not so successful side of using greenhouse gas offsets in CEQA, and there is this uphill battle in some areas of the state with overcoming the local aspect of offset mitigation. So I've always wondered what a local offset market would look like, and more recently felt that a larger net, like a regional or statewide market, is the better fit. But a few things are clear. If this was easy, it would have already been done. Also, it will, by nature, look different. Something will have to give. Maybe it's a different criteria. Maybe additional isn't required. Maybe it's just something that hasn't happened because there was no funding and the project provides the funding towards, let's say, a new transit station, or maybe cost is what gives. In my experience, that local offsets are more expensive, sometimes substantially. So how do you make the cost feasible? I don't have answers to these questions, but it's not appropriate for individual CEQA applicants to pursue their own local mitigation for many reasons. And a bank where real experts can implement real changes and do real good, even if it looks different, is something I'd like to see tried. And that's why I'm really excited and encouraged by this group of interested parties coming together, because it's the stepping stone to figuring these things out and how we can make real progress with fighting climate change and potentially do something good for our communities along the way. So I know mine was a long one. Thank you for hanging in there with me. Back to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was wonderful. Now we'll go to Karla Dailey, who's the Acting Assistant Director of Utilities with the City of Palo Alto Resource Management Utilities.
Thank you. How's the screen looking?
Looking great.
Okay, great. Thank you. My name is Karla Dailey. I'm with the City of Palo Alto Utilities Department, and I'm going to talk to you today about our experience with purchasing carbon offsets for our gas utility. Here's a little agenda. I'll describe Palo Alto to you a bit, talk about our sustainability goals, the natural gas, the carbon neutral gas program for our natural gas utility, and then get into some details about how we've implemented that program. So Palo Alto is a city in Silicon Valley. We have about 70,000 residents and about 100,000 jobs here in the city. So more people coming in during the day than living here. And the unique thing about Palo Alto is that we own and operate all of our own utilities. So all of the pipes and wires within the city boundaries are owned and operated by us, including our natural gas utility, our electric utility, water, sanitary sewer, and fiber, in addition to our public works department, which runs our stormwater utility and garbage collection. And we also have our the sewage treatment plant here in Palo Alto that's owned and operated by us and serves not only ourselves, but 5 other partner agencies surrounding us. So the utility I'm going to focus on today is the gas utility. We have about 25,000 customers. Most of them are residential customers. That's about 25 million therms a year that we burn. That results in around 130, that should be 1,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions. A few zeros missing there, sorry about that. So in addition, the city has, not just the utilities, but the city as a whole has some very aggressive climate goals, 80% greenhouse gas reduction by the year 2030. And on the utility side, really the primary objective is to electrify. So to eventually be able to almost completely get rid of our gas utility and move most residential and commercial facilities to all electric. So included in that plan is kind of a bridge strategy to provide, to make our gas emissions that are made by folks just using gas here in our city carbon neutral through the use of offsets. But when we show our greenhouse gas reduction targets and achievements in the context of the sustainability plan, we do not include those offsets that neutralize our gas utility use. So when we're showing our emissions, we're still showing all of the greenhouse gas emissions that are a result of the gas being burned at Palo Alto, even though we're buying offsets for them. So how did this program come about? Originally, the first voluntary environmental program that we had here in utilities was an electric program. We called it Palo Alto Green, and customers could pay a little extra on their bill to green up their electric usage. That program was sourced through renewable energy credits, or RECs, and it was wildly successful, wildly popular here in Palo Alto. We had about 25% of our residents participating in that program. We won all kinds of awards for it. There's the little graphic on the right side of my slide is a sample of one of the yard signs that we had for people participating in the program, and they were all over town. People loved them. But as our electric portfolio became carbon neutral itself, we have a large share in a federal hydro project, and then a very aggressive program to purchase renewable energy. That voluntary pay extra on your bill program became moot because the portfolio was in essence carbon neutral already. And so as we decided to wind that down, we thought, well, here's the perfect chance to spool up a gas program. We've been thinking about it for years and saw the opportunity to tell our customers, the bad news is this program that you love, Palo Alto Green, is going away. The good news is your electric portfolio is carbon neutral, and we have a new program that you can participate in order to neutralize your gas emissions. So we started that program. It was a voluntary opt-in program, very much like the Palo Alto Green electric program had been modeled the same as that one was, but supplied by carbon offsets instead of RECs because it was natural gas emissions and not renewable energy. At the same time we were starting that program, we went into a drought. And so a lot of our messaging that was going out from the utilities was about the drought and about saving water. And, you know, we really try not to hit our customers with too many messages at once, which is tough because we run all these utilities. And so we weren't really marketing that Palo Alto Green Gas program very aggressively. And as a result, we had pretty low participation, about 4% of residents, which was sort of dismal compared to our 25% that we had on the electric side. So we had some local activists who were really frustrated with the low participation rates, and they were advocating for an opt-out program instead of an opt-in program, meaning everybody gets slammed into it and then you have to call up your utility and say, hey, I don't want to be in this. We didn't like that idea. We thought that was bad for our relation with our customers and difficult to administer. And so we proposed an alternative, which was to make the entire gas portfolio carbon neutral and not give customers a choice whether to be in or out of that. So that's kind of where we are today. At the time that was adopted by the council, there was a lot of discussion around offsets and are they real? Do we like these? Do we believe in them? But ultimately they did agree to source that program with offsets. And then that continued on through into the next phase, which was making the whole portfolio carbon neutral. We did in our original pitch to the finance committee and council include some renewable natural gas because we heard the first time around that they really liked renewable natural gas. It's very expensive. It's very difficult to find. And so we proposed that we would have a rate impact cap for the gas customers, and we would buy as much renewable natural gas as we could, with the remainder being offsets in order to hit that rate cap. The finance committee said, why would we do that if we like offsets and we think they're real? Let's just do the cheaper option. And so we scrapped the renewable natural gas part of our proposal. The rate impact is 10%, 10 cents per therm, which is about $19 a ton in offset pricing terms. And one of the ways that we did satisfy the concerns about what types of products we were buying is that we only buy offsets from projects that are the CARB approved project types. So we are not buying CARB certified offsets because we would need those for compliance reasons. This is not a compliance program. This is a self-imposed program by our council on ourselves. We adhere also to the CARB vintage criteria, so we don't buy anything older than 2006. And in the original implementation plan, council said that they preferred California projects, but they didn't place a dollar premium on that. And so a couple of years later, we went back to kind of just reaffirm that the council wanted us to keep continuing with this program and sort of force the issue on the, how much do you prefer California projects? And council said, oh, well, we don't want to pay anything extra for them. And so, you know, if two projects come in and the price is equal, we'll pick the California one. But if not, California doesn't get any special consideration. We do have five agreements with brokers that we use to purchase offsets. I'd be happy to share our contract with anybody. Maybe I can send it to Melissa after the webinar if anybody's interested in that. We developed it in-house because we didn't find anything out there as a template that we liked. There is a lot out there for compliance offsets, but not so much for the voluntary. We only buy on the spot market, meaning we don't invest in projects that will produce offsets over a long term. We buy offsets that have already been generated and verified, kind of like walking into Walmart and looking at the shoebox of forestry carbon offsets. We buy them, throw them in the trash on our way out so that nobody else can buy them. We did have actually two transactions, one project that was kind of interesting. The city of Oaxaca is a sister city of Palo Alto's, and a local really involved citizen who's part of our Neighbors Abroad program has been really thinking about how we can collaborate more with our sister cities on sustainability matters, and identified a forestry project just outside of Oaxaca. So we've done two transactions with a nonprofit in Mexico to buy offsets from that forestry project. The protocol looks very similar to the forestry protocol that the registry uses here in the United States, with a few minor differences to comply with Mexican law. Overall, our cost has been around 3 to 4 cents per therm, which is well under what our cap was. Here's a quick pie chart of the makeup of what we have purchased. Certainly, and overwhelmingly, we've purchased U.S. forestry offsets. We did have one big mine methane capture purchase that we made, and then you can see the smattering of other things that we've purchased. Some other things that we've considered as we've been running this program: we have a refrigerator recycling program here in Palo Alto, where folks can put their old refrigerators out on the curb, and we pick them up and make sure that the dangerous refrigerants are go through destruction in a proper way. And we thought, wow, wouldn't it be cool to use those offsets generated from that program back in our natural gas program? But turns out it's a really tiny quantity and they're really expensive, so we haven't done that. The folks down in Oaxaca are always in a cash crunch and would really love for us to be investing in the project for the long term, and sort of buying in and then buying offsets back from the project as they accrue. But that really deviates from our current spot purchase policy, and also may be a little at odds with our desire to really get rid of the gas utility in the long term. There's also credit issues. Neighbors Abroad tried to get together to provide private backing for a letter of credit, and they weren't able to pull that off. And the city is definitely not, we're pretty risk averse and don't like money hanging out there without some pretty good credit assurances. There's also been an interest in offsets from our own urban forestry projects. Palo Alto loves its trees. We have a lot of trees, but even as many trees as Palo Alto might like to plant, we're only 25 square miles. We're talking about a pretty small number of offsets that would be generated by a planting effort, and additionality is questionable at least in that sort of a program. There's also been some council interest in offsets from reforestation in California as a result of some of the wildfires that we've seen. We haven't seen a project come up yet. And again, that's a different contract structure. It wouldn't be spot purchases. It would be long-term investments, which again has the same sort of problem with the forestry investment in Oaxaca as far as the mismatch with how our program is structured. So that was a quick makeup for being behind on the schedule presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karla. And actually, Karla has to leave a little early. So if anybody has questions for Karla, you could raise your hand now.
Do you want me to call on people, Melissa? I see Andy has a hand up.
Yeah.
Hi, Karla. Thank you for the good presentation. One question, has the city considered maybe some incentives for residents to shift out of natural gas HVAC systems and go into heat pumps, and then maybe be able to claim the reductions from some kind of evaluation as to what the average reduction would have on an annual basis for that kind of transition?
We are trying to figure out what to do with incentives. This is a whole can of worms, our electrification plan here in the city. We're really going through some interesting discussions with the community right now to try and figure out how to do this, because I think Palo Alto is in this really unique position where we're the city, we're the land management agency. We also own all these utilities. And so we really see the challenges of winding down the gas system, the challenges of getting the electric distribution system up to a point that can handle mass electrification. And so we're trying to figure out how to do the long-term system-wide planning and keep moving forward with all this electrification in the best geographic places in the city where the system has the capacity to handle it. So yes, we are looking at incentives. We're looking at how to roll those out to meet all those objectives. And as far as claiming the credits from them, we have not looked at that. Yeah, that really hasn't been part of the equation. We're just trying to electrify and meet those greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals.
Thank you.
Karla, a question in the chat. Could you clarify if there's an existing building electrification ordinance? I believe the answer is yes, but if you want to.
There is for new construction.
For new construction. And then I'm just going to do one last question here. Karla, can you equate 3 to 4 cents per therm to the price of 1 metric ton of CO2?
Right, it's about $7 to $8.
Great. Thank you so much, Karla.
Thank you.
Yeah. And now we're going to go move on to Jewel Persad, Campus Sustainability Manager at UCSB.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and enter presentation mode. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the UC carbon neutrality goals, where UC Santa Barbara is in terms of achieving those goals, what we need in terms of offsets, and then jump into some of the work we've done around ensuring quality within the UC system and at UC Santa Barbara. So just a brief overview of what our goals are. So system-wide, we have a goal to achieve carbon neutrality for scopes 1 and 2. So that's our operational emissions, purchased electricity, natural gas on campus, our refrigerant emissions, as well as campus fleet by 2025. And then goals that include also scope 3 emissions commuting and business air travel, and achieving carbon neutrality by 2050 for scope 3 as well. In addition, all the campuses had a 1990 level reduction goal by 2020. UC Santa Barbara achieved this back in 2014. And then in terms of these goals, we have a prioritized list of how we were achieve them. So first, smart growth. So all UC new buildings have to be electric. And then looking at energy efficiency conservation, utility scale clean electricity, which I'll get into. And when I talk about our emissions, biomethane, and then once we've gotten those reductions, looking to offsets to meet any remaining emissions come 2025. So I wanted to share a little bit about what our emissions look like as a campus and how close we are to achieving those goals. This is just some historical emissions and out to 2020. So for the last 10 or 11 years, we have reported our emissions to the climate registry, and we have our scopes 1 and 2 third-party verified. So you'll see what our historical emissions look like. And we got a drop off in 2020. And a lot of that for commuting air travel was because of COVID, and we were all remote. So take those with a grain of salt. But we've seen huge reductions in our purchase electricity emissions. And just put this in framing, our campus has doubled our gross square footage since 1990. We went from about 4 million to 8 million. So we've had huge growth. So this has meant huge improvements in terms of energy use intensity. So these are the numbers in terms of what the emissions look like broken out by scope for 1990 and 2020. So scope 2, we've seen huge changes. And this is because in July of 2020, UC Santa Barbara went off Southern California Edison as our electricity provider, and we joined the UC Clean Power program. So the UC system is an energy provider, and they verify their emissions factors for the electricity and report them through the California Energy Commission. And they have been, we have been receiving carbon neutral electricity through them from 2019 as a UC system. You'll see the scope 3 changes for air travel and commuting emissions. And a large part, this has been due to COVID. And I just want to mention, because I know some folks are different and long in terms of calculating emissions. For scopes 1 and 2, it's very easy for us because we get our utility bills for our campus and our metered bills. For scopes 3, for air travel, we look at total spend on air travel for business air travel, and we have Concur. It's a booking system, and they track mileage as well. So we use that to estimate air travel. And for commuting emissions, we do ask our campus community to fill out a commuter mode split survey every year with how they commuted to campus, if they drove in a single occupancy vehicle, what days of the week they came, what the mileage is. So we're getting pretty good data to do these estimates. So I already mentioned that we're now getting 100% clean electricity for our campus. There's a few off-campus meters at our reserves that aren't getting power through the UC Clean Power program, but 99% of our electricity is carbon neutral. We also have 6.2 megawatts of solar on campus, and we have 1.9 million square feet of LEED building. We have a new classroom building that is going to be 100% carbon neutral in its operation. So no natural gas, and it's going to be served by clean electricity. It's coming online very shortly. So that's exciting. So this is just another picture that shows 2019, 2020 and projections for 2021. So you'll see a huge shift in our emissions in terms of where it's coming from. So back in 2019, 2018, it was about 50-50 for operations in terms of our emissions coming from purchased electricity and stationary combustion. So these are boilers on campus that use natural gas, and to now looking at natural gas being our main source of emissions. And this is for boilers for existing buildings. So that is like the huge elephant in the room that we need to electrify existing buildings. And a lot of campuses are in similar boats in the UC system. So this is just a UC wide what emissions look like. And so you can see to achieve 2025 goal, there's a huge need for offsets. For our campus, we want to electrify existing buildings, but it requires a huge influx of capital to do those projects. And we're looking at fundraising right now. But business as usual projections, continuing our energy efficiency programs, we're looking at needing about 14,000 metric tons of offsets come 2025 to meet those UC-wide policy goals. So that's just the UC and UCSB perspective. I want to talk a little bit now about offsets and what we've done to try to ensure quality, since the UC as a system and UCSB will need them to meet our climate goals. So there's been a lot of research coming out of the UC system by our faculty, really critical of the use of offsets and the additionality of offsets, finding a lot of the international renewable energy projects, forest management projects, which are huge portions of the offset market globally, have issues with leakage and additionality and permanence. And so acknowledging this, I'm just going to go to the next slide because a lot of this has come from the Berkeley Carbon Trading Project, and the director there is Barbara Haya, and she actually has been working with the UC system since about 2017-18 to help us do a lot of our quality work around ensuring offsets. And so she's a real expert in this, and a lot of research has come out critical of offsets. So in light of needing offsets, our faculty being critical of offsets, our students being critical of offsets, especially with weighing, spending money on campus versus, purchasing offsets. We'd really have to evaluate our strategy. So, our UCSB perspective is that we want to make sure that their offsets, if we purchase them, really have real emissions reductions. And we don't want to send funds off campus unless we have that certainty of additionality. So we prefer investing in energy efficiency and conservation on our campus, because a lot of that comes with savings, and it's not an annual expense, where offsets is an annual expense. Also, making sure that our offsets align with the UC mission, our teaching goals, and our public service goals. So that's been really important to us as well. So with that in mind, in 2019, under the leadership of Barbara Haya and the UC Office of the President, we did a call for requests for ideas for UC-initiated offset projects. We got over 80 submittals, and we funded 12 projects as part of a pilot. And this is really to see if we could utilize our faculty expertise and the research they're already doing and the work they're already doing to create our own offset projects. And this is just an example of 5 projects that have shown a lot of prominence. There are several other projects as well that the UC system is considering investing in. And so there's Cook Stove projects. Unite to Light is actually a local project at UC that came out of UCSB and the Institute for Energy Efficiency. And then there's avoided deforestation projects, which we see problems with on the market. But the one benefit about UC initiated projects that we have the ability to help correct some issues that we found in the protocols and to work with the developers to make sure we're ensuring, additionality, we're ensuring any social justice issues. We're making sure that there's real co-benefits with those projects as well. So in addition to the UC initiated projects, We also felt that there was a need for UC offsets policy that set minimum standards for each of the campuses. So I believe it was last summer, all my years with COVID blend together. We drafted our first UC offsets policy, and it went through a huge vetting process on each of the campuses with public presentations, feedback from students, faculty, and staff. And then it was approved by the UC system just a couple months ago, but it prioritizes direct reductions of scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions before purchasing offsets. So making that explicit in our policy, setting high quality offset standards for the campus, and making sure we're aligning the offsets we choose with our mission and making sure it's scalable. So the whole UC carbon neutrality initiative is really meant to be something the UC can achieve and show that scalable and come up with solutions for California and the nation. So some of the procedures in the policy, and the policy is public, and I'm happy to share it after the meeting as well. Make sure that we're confirming additionality of the project, durability of the project, and making sure it's enforceable, and setting standards around peer review of the offsets projects itself to make sure we meet our policy goals. So now we have a UC system-wide policy setting standards for offsets. The offsets market's pretty complicated, and it's hard to assess whether or not you're achieving high quality offsets. And research has pointed out there's huge problems with the protocol, even for third-party verified offsets on the voluntary market. So we've started a process of coming up with the strategy for making sure we're meeting those standards. And so out of that, we formed a UC offsets technical committee that's set up to advise our energy services governing board, which would be the members that are going to be making the purchases of the offsets itself, to look at a few different things for the UC system, the volume offsets each campus will need for 2021 through 2026. I mentioned UCSB achieved our 1990 goals, so we don't need any offsets until 2025 when the carbon neutrality goal comes up. Setting a prioritized list of the categories and project types of available offsets that we want to focus on, because our researchers and faculty have found that there's different project types that have better protocol and are better quality than other project types, and you don't run into some of the issues. Looking at UC initiated offsets and setting prioritization for some of those projects, and then proposing a portfolio for each of the campuses to procure, as well as a vetting process and a schedule, and evaluating market risks and costs. So we've seen a huge increase in offset prices in the last couple of years, and with everyone's, as we see these goals approaching for carbon neutrality and climate goals, we're seeing huge price increases. So looking at whether or not we want to purchase and bank them for when we need them as a campus and a system. And so we're now going through this process and coming up with some recommendations. There's a general strong preference within the UC system for UC initiated offsets because of the control we have over them and the ability to really shape the projects and ensure additionality and co-benefits. But yeah, I think that is it for me. So I'm going to just pass it back over.
Thank you, Joel. And now we'll go to Chris Reed, Sustainability Manager at the City of San Luis Obispo. I'm actually going to share mine.
While the slides load, I just want to say good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Reed. I'm the Sustainability Manager at the City of San Luis Obispo. And just wanted to say excellent job to all the previous presenters, both today and in the previous sessions. And think there are people with such deep expertise in the fields of CEQA and brokerage of carbon offsets, et cetera, that so far exceed my expertise that we won't touch on that. But given where we are with timing today, just wanted to have a sort of narrow conversation that talks about the potential scale of carbon offset demand. If the slow experience is like anyone else's, it really seems like the potential demand for offsets over the next decades could be pretty staggering. But before we move from that, generally our PowerPoints on the panel to the right have a beautiful picture of our rolling hills or something from our lovely downtown. But this is my favorite thing in town. It's our anaerobic digester. And it's where all of our green waste goes to create high quality compost and clean electricity. So I feel like if there's any audience that would be particularly appreciative of this beautiful piece of our community, it would be this one. So anyway, next slide, please. Wanted to give a quick background on the policy framework around which a conversation about offsets could occur. And it would talk specifically about should our city ever move towards a space where we would consider offset credits, just what that scale of demand looks like at the community level and then at the project level. All right, next slide, please. So in 2020, our council adopted our climate action plan, which includes a goal of carbon neutrality by 2035 in our community. I'll talk about this in just a second. Our actual goal for purpose of having a qualified GHG reduction strategy is consistent with SB 32. So we had this gap between the things that we regulate new development on and what our aspirational goals as a community are. Talk a little bit about San Luis Obispo. This is important just because if we're going to talk about scale of potential demand, it's helpful to know who we are. So about 47,000 people. That's about 1% of the entire population of California. We're not particularly carbon intensive on a per capita basis. Our daytime population swells a little bit, but really, a relatively small community. So next slide, please. I say that because even though we're a relatively small community, we still have in 2035, we're expecting to have close to 400,000 metric ton CO2e community-wide emissions. We take into considerations around state laws and programs around just the baseline emissions reductions as a result of renewable portfolio standards, low carbon fuel standards, et cetera, et cetera. We take about 102,000 metric tons off of that. The remainder of the reductions here around clean energy systems, green buildings, our connected communities, which is transportation and land use, circular economy, which is green waste, and natural solutions, which is applying some of these land management strategies for carbon sequestration on our own land, gets us pretty far down the GHG reduction strategy. I'll say that the emissions reductions associated with the estimates we think are ambitious but doable, but they really sort of push the edges of our abilities as a city to affect emissions reductions over time. And so even having the assumptions be at their max feasible and reasonable in our workbooks, at the end of the day, we still have about 111,000 metric tons of emissions that at the community level, we don't have a clear strategy for reducing yet. At the time of our adoption, we were clear that we would prefer to address those remaining emissions through additional local reductions. We're hopeful that the infrastructure bill will provide additional funding that, fingers crossed, this Congress will be able to pass additional climate legislation. The governor's climate funding in this recent appropriations bill can hopefully also juice some of our capacity, the assumptions that underlie these numbers. And so that 111,000 metric tons remaining emissions in 2035 will get smaller and smaller over time. But really, these are emissions that even in a community with deep council alignment, sort of all the winds blowing in the right direction to be successful, we still have this left over. I mentioned that we're just one tenth of 1% of California's population, because it just goes to show that if this is where we're landing, even after all of this good work, it's kind of staggering to think about the MTCO2E that would be remaining out there across California communities. As I just said, our commitment is to find ways to reduce those emissions through additional local measures. But if we had a council or community that was aligned around carbon offset credits, or if that ended up being the only feasible way to achieve the goal, and that was something that the community wanted to prioritize, it just goes to show, how many units of demand are out there at the community level. Next slide, please. And that all assumes that projects are consistent with our land use element and our CEQA around our climate action plan. So we have local thresholds of significance. They're very low. They're 0.7 MTCO2E per resident and non-resident for just commercial projects. And for mixed use, it's 0.9 metric tons per person. And so in addition to that 100,000 or so MTCO2E that could exist, that would need to be offset potentially at a project level, we're seeing projects come through that do have these additional needs in order to comply with these thresholds. Not wanting to put any project on the spot, I sort of amalgamated a bunch of projects just for the sake of scale and kind of generalized it to general order of magnitude. And we have 50 to 60 projects right now that are in some form of either at the planning counter, at the building counter, or in construction. And you look at the MTCO2E for those that require, I know not all of those projects require this level of review under CEQA, of course, but for those that do, that are trying to become consistent with our climate plan using our local quantitative thresholds, we're seeing between 1,000, 1,500 MTCO2E per project that still needs to be sort of resolved in some way. So there's ways that they're addressing that with local changes to their projects, all the ways that the CEQA practitioners on here are better versed at talking about. But still, when you just think about that 100,000 units across the community, and you think about the 1,000 or so potential units per project in just San Luis Obispo alone, and then you scale that across California, I think that it really underscores how critical it is that the solutions to these be scaled, and how really ripe the opportunity is to scale them. And then finally, how the sort of responsibility we all have as practitioners to ensure that those offset credits are achieving the reductions in the way that we expect them to, in the way that we've been talking about so far. Next slide. Got ahead about this one. So that was really the closing point I wanted to make. And I want to keep it short and sweet because, again, everyone else had such good information and just wanted to share the sort of scale. So with that, I think we've done my presentation, and I think the group will be open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So just a reminder that our next session is next week on Wednesday, and it's Beyond Carbon Markets, Holistic and Integrated Projects and Stewardship. So at this point, we're gonna go to the group for questions. If you have a question and you haven't put it into the chat, feel free to raise your hand or use the raise hand function. I'm not seeing any raised hands. Oh, here we go. Leslie Perel, I'm going to allow you to talk now. Leslie, I think you actually have to unmute yourself. I'm not sure. There's somebody else with their hand raised that doesn't have their name in the participant list. I'll allow you to talk right now. If you can.
Can you hear me?
Yes, there you go.
Oh, wonderful. You know, my apologies. My name is Angel Green. I'm with Placer County, the project manager for the county sustainability plan. Unfortunately, my link I originally signed up for wasn't working. In fact, I missed the last meeting, so that might be why my name's not showing up. My question is for Jennifer Reed or for anyone else who might be able to answer this. I'm wondering if there's any guidance. I've been searching probably for the last 2 years on good guidance and just information that's available on what you can use to determine the life of a project for the purposes of calculating CEQA mitigation requirements for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I am aware that there are a couple of jurisdictions who have used anywhere in a range from like 20 years to 30 years. So I'm just curious, is there any good information out there that might be available to assist a jurisdiction with calculating perhaps what the life of a project would be? And this could be either for construction, but also for operational emissions.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it seems like you've definitely done your research. Can anyone hear me? Am I still underwater?
Yes.
Yeah, you know, in the past, the ones I've seen float around, there's the 20, 30, slow had 25 or 50. The most common one I will say is 30 years. And I feel that CEQA consultants have been pretty comfortable with that. But I will also say in one of those San Diego cases that was brought up. So I've been comfortable using it. There's no statewide industry standard one. So what I would say is think about your project. So there's very standard, you know, commercial, retail, residential development. A lot of times that 30-year works well for that. Other projects may have a project-specific lifetime, renewable project, a mining projects, those things, they may be more unique, and that's when maybe you'd want to put your thinking cap on and discuss that with the applicant and then provide that substantial evidence to support that. It's not the best answer.
No, I appreciate that. The San Diego case that you were referring to, is that the Golden Door case
Right.
that spoke to the lifetime? Okay, I'll look at that.
You know, I get actually lifetime comments a lot on EIR, so I understand why you're asking this question. It was one of those other cases that the lifetime came.
I know there was a few San Diego. Okay, I'll have to go back and look at my notes on those. Okay, thank you.
Does anyone else have anything else to share? I know, Andy, I know you guys have changed your guidance. We kind of convinced you to go from 25 to 30, but.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer.
I have a thought to share on that topic, if I may.
Oh yeah, hi Austin.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Something I just thinking about sort of on my own recently is, you know, the new buildings that are built, new projects that are built, they're really going to last a lot longer than 30 years. I mean, we currently have buildings that are completely functional in the state that are more than 100 years old, or certainly more than 30 years old. And so the idea is, in theory, there's going to be a moment in the future when the state electric grid is carbon neutral. What's the target year for that? Is it 2025? I don't remember off the top of my head. And then in theory, there's going to be a moment in time in the future when mobile sources are zero emission vehicles. So one idea is to use an operational life that starts the first year of the project and ends in this theoretical future moment in time when both of those end goals are achieved. So essentially, might refer to this as the provisional operational life, that length of time the project would be operational until our state achieves its goals. So I just want to throw that thought out there.
Yeah, thank you. I know I kind of briefly
I'd love to share it sometime.
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, 30 years from now, the emission inventory for projects are going to be look quite different. So even though someone may say the building's going to be there for 100 years, in 100 years, the emission inventory is not going to look like what it is today. So that's a great consideration.
And I'll add on to that too. One of the things that we thought about when we shifted from 50 to 30 years was the fact that for most buildings within 30 years, they end up replacing HVAC systems and things like that. So we thought that, 30 years might catch that. That might be a good sweet spot.
We have another question from Leslie Purcell. The question is, can you see your San Luis Obispo implement local solar production through rooftop, parking lot, municipal, commercial facilities, etc., as offsets? And if so, get funding for that.
I can touch that from UCSB. So we have 6.4 megawatts of solar on our campus, rooftops, parking lots, etc. That reduces our direct use of electricity. So it's a direct reduction in our emissions. So since we're already taking credit for it in our direct scope of emissions, we wouldn't get offsets for it. So offsets would be something done that isn't included in that scope.
It'd be similar for us as well, right? So our generation provider is Central Coast Community Energy. We use the portfolio method to estimate the emissions associated with electricity consumption. And so any project that would be large enough to enter into that portfolio would just be sort of accounted for in that portfolio's emissions coefficient. And it's interesting to think about how more complicated systems that were able to further reduce emissions beyond that could be accounted for, but the electricity section is just, it doesn't seem like the additionality would be there.
See, we have another question coming on chat. For demolition projects, which qualify as new development in some cases, could an offset project lifetime of less than 30 years be appropriate?
I can start on that one. So for me, I feel like with the demolition, this is kind of like the construction side of the CEQA equation. So unlike operation, where you estimate like the first build out year, and then you multiply it by the lifetime, I would estimate every year of that demolition project, that's your inventory, or then that's your offset responsibility, depending on what your numeric threshold is. And then I would likely in the mitigation, have it all offset before you started the demolition of it. But I would treat it more kind of like a construction and have a finite one versus, because it doesn't keep lasting in the future. It's an activity that starts and ends and it's done.
I have a raised hand from Shelley Sussman. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
I did. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
I'm a planner in Ventura County. Thank you all for some great information. I have sort of a, I don't know, procedurally esoteric question. As part of our general plan, we have lots of different agencies and departments who have programs that are supposed to result in eventual greenhouse gas emissions. And we have an obligation to report out annually or according to some schedule to our board and to the community. And we're working now under the leadership of our sustainability group in the CEO's office to try to figure out how are we going to standardize our calculations and our metrics and our reporting and just make sure that everybody in the county is working together in some sort of consistent way to, count these greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm just wondering if anybody out there has good kind of lessons learned for, you guys are all like the two, like your UC person and your city of San Luis, like, I'm assuming you guys have the major responsibility for counting and reporting out and all of that. And so like, how do you go out into your organization and get that information from the people outside your own divisions? And are there good strategies and tools and reporting mechanisms that you've seen for doing that? Sorry, that's a very long-winded question, but part of our charge is making all of this really transparent, right? And letting people know how we're doing. So if anybody has any good things to say, I'd be interested in hearing it. Thanks.
I can take a shot. And I'll just observe that if you are looking for procedurally esoteric conversation, then I think you've come to the right place, and is certainly inbounds on the set of questions. I think the inventorying question is really interesting. I mean, just like process-wise, we just it lives in our Office of Sustainability, and we convene and coordinate across departments and agencies and the community to develop our emissions inventories and then post those for transparency's sake, following community protocol as directed by CARB and ICLEI, et cetera. So that's pretty straightforward. I do think there's a bigger question in the offset conversation around, in the CEQA conversation around inventory protocol and the sort of emergingly complicated nature, not just of carbon offsets, but even of like how the electricity system functions, and having a greater understanding of how time and place dependent greenhouse gas emissions are based from the grid's perspective as we electrify everything, the sort of downstream ripples that has. But I feel like that might be a better conversation for another webinar series.
Let's see, Austin Kerr, you still have your hand raised. Did you still have a question or?
Oh, sorry, I'm just not good at putting my hand down.
Okay. Does anybody else have a question? Well, seeing none, I want to really thank our 4 speakers today. It was very interesting and informative, and I enjoyed the conversation. And again, I just want to remind everyone that next Wednesday at 3:30, we have session 4, which will go beyond carbon markets to explore ways in which land stewards are already caring for the land through regenerative practices and how non-market programs can support them. So we hope to see you there. Thank you.